Steve, if you'll come forward. Steve Jester, pastor of Second Presbyterian Church, has the privilege of introducing our wonderful guest speaker today. Please welcome Steve Jester.
Thank you, President Alice. It is my privilege to introduce the speaker for today's meeting, Jean Bishop. Ms. Bishop is a graduate of Northwestern University's School of Journalism and School of Law. She attended Yale Law School as a visiting student, and she is currently an adjunct professor at Northwestern, professor of law. And she is also a Cook County, Chicago area public defender. Jean Bishop is perhaps best known, or at least to me, as the sister of Nancy Bishop Langert, who was shot to death along with her husband and unborn child on April the 7th, 1990. They were shot by a teenager named David Biro. And that horrific trauma was the beginning of a journey of transformation in Ms. Bishop's life. She quit her job as a corporate attorney, and she went to work as a public defender. And through a several-year process of wrestling with her response to that terrible event, that senseless taking of life, Ms. Bishop came to the conclusion that she needed to somehow forgive Mr. Biro. She contacted him in prison and thus began a very powerful story of reconciliation. That story is told in her recent book, Change of Heart, Justice, Mercy, and Making Peace with My Sister's Killer. That book will be on sale in that corner of the room following our meeting today and signed by her. And best of all, 35% discount today. Jean Bishop is a prominent advocate for gun violence prevention, for abolition of the death penalty, and she is a leading voice in the conversation concerning the role of faith in such issues. I came across a quotation from her in a recent article, and she describes herself this way: "I am a lawyer and also a Christian. My faith tells me that everyone is beloved of God, endowed with dignity and worth, precious and capable of redemption." In our current climate of fear and suspicion and anger, I believe that hers is a voice that we desperately need to hear. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Jean Bishop to the Downtown Rotary Club.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. I have to stand here. I'm a trial lawyer and I have to move around. I'm so honored to be here. I'm a lawyer. I'm the granddaughter and daughter of lawyers. My grandfather, John Brzee, was the 4-term Republican state's attorney of Champaign County, Illinois. And he spoke to clubs like this and was a member. And my father was a Rotarian, and I was raised along with my older sister Jennifer and my younger sister Nancy as believing in this idea of having a kind of a 4-legged stool of your home, your family, your church, and your community. And this was such an important part of the community to him. So to me, all of you look so beautiful. You don't see it, but I do. You have these halos over your heads, this kind of glow of light with all the good that you do. So thank you. I love that we're gathering together. And can everyone hear me okay? No, you cannot. Is this better? Yeah. How is that? Is that better?
Maybe if I turn these off.
Okay. They're off. All right, is this better? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're in this moment of where we've just come through this very divisive election and kind of limping out and having this moment where there's so much kind of division and everything, but there's one thing that people have agreed on from all different spectrums, and that is the need for reform of the criminal justice system. So we not only have voices like Michelle Alexander, who wrote a wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, explaining the sources of mass incarceration, and Brian Stevenson, the head of Equal Justice Initiative, who wrote this wonderful book called Just Mercy. But we also have Newt Gingrich and his group Right on Crime. We have one of the Koch brothers writing in the Wall Street Journal about how we're locking up too many people for too long for nonviolent crimes. And we have the Koch brothers themselves establishing this initiative called Generation Opportunity, that's trying to have millennials go out and work against the things that are locking up so many people. This is a statistic you all may be familiar with already, but we have in the United States have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. That we lock up more people than any nation on earth, more than China or Russia or Iran. And so it's an issue that is important to me because as a murder victim's family member and as a public defender, I kind of bring the perspective of having a foot in both worlds. And what I've seen as I've looked around as a public defender are some things we need to work on that we can change. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about and then hear your thoughts. As you heard from that very kind introduction that Steve gave me, I come to this issue because I had started my career after Northwestern as a corporate attorney and doing work for a big law firm. And one night, my family went out to dinner. My mom, my dad, my younger sister Nancy, and her husband Richard and I went out to dinner to celebrate the happiest of occasions, which was that Nancy was pregnant. She was 3 months pregnant with what would have been her first child. And we were all over the moon because even though Nancy was the youngest, she was the baby in the family, she was the first that was going to be a mom. So this would have been my parents' first grandchild and my first little niece or nephew. And we all hugged goodbye that night, and when Nancy and Richard went back to their home, the killer was waiting for them. He had broken into the townhouse by cutting the glass in the sliding glass door in the back. He had a .357 Magnum revolver that he pointed at them. He forced them into the basement, and even though they told him that Nancy was pregnant and please not to hurt her, that they offered him their belongings, money, and nothing was taken. He took them in the basement, and then he put the gun to the back of Richard's head and fired once and killed him execution style. And then he turned the gun on Nancy, and covering up her own head instinctively, he fired instead into her pregnant side and abdomen twice and left her there to bleed to death. And when I tried to call for help and I think realized no help was coming, she dragged herself over to Richard's body, and before she died did this extraordinary thing. She wrote a message of love in her own blood in the floor next to him, a heart shape with the letter U, love you. And that was her last word on this life. And so after she was killed, and for 6 months we didn't know who it was. It took 6 months to arrest this teenager, this young man, David Vera, and to take him to trial, and he received a life sentence for that. And in that interim, I realized that life is very short, and that you have to do what's deeply meaningful and what's good for the world, and to honor God and the God that gives this gift of life. And that's when I became a public defender. And as I looked around the landscape of the place where I work, here's what I find. First of all, we have a situation where, because of the money bail system, if you are someone who doesn't have a lot of money, you can't get out of jail while the charges against you are pending. And so often, because my clients don't even have $100 to post to get out of custody while they're fighting their charges, they give up and they want to plead guilty just to get out of jail. And I'll beg them not to. I'll say, please don't. You're going to give yourself a felony conviction. It'll be hard to get a job the rest of your life. Yes.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I want to make sure you can hear
Yeah, everyone wants to hear you, and they're not hearing you in the back.
I'm sorry. No. Is this better? Okay, I apologize. So bail is one problem. A second problem that I see is mandatory minimum sentences. There are many crimes in my jurisdiction, and I suspect in yours too, where no matter what your background is, if you're charged with a particular offense, you cannot get probation. It's a mandatory prison sentence. A third problem that I encounter are sentence enhancements, where if you have accumulated a certain background, it ups and ups the penalty to a longer and longer prison sentence. We have a lack of, we have the juvenile life without parole sentence. That's the sentence that my sister's killer is serving. And that means that even a crime that you committed as a teenager, as young as 14, 15, or 16 years old, you can be locked up for the rest of your life. And what life without parole means is that you go into prison and you die there. There's never a second look at you where we say, you know, are you rehabilitated? Are you remorseful? Can you be released safely into society? You go into prison and you come out in a coffin. We are the only nation on earth that uses that sentence, the only one. We have a death penalty still in the majority of US states, and we are one of the few Western industrialized democracies that still has a death penalty. And that is a sentence that, like that juvenile life without parole sentence, is merciless in a sense. It says to people, we are never going to bring you back, we're going to throw you away. And so that is another thing. We have the power to inject mercy into this system. This is what I'm advocating for mercy in the criminal justice system. And there's a number of ways we can do that. One is legislatively. We can try to pass laws that will scale back these things like bail, like the mandatory minimums, the sentence enhancements. We have also in the executive branch the power of clemency. And this is something that every state governor has for state crimes, and the President of the United States has for federal crimes. And the clemency power is not just, you know, the one that we're more familiar with, which is the pardon power, like, you know, saying it's as if you never did your crime at all. There's also the commutation power, where you can say you served a very long sentence, that's enough. You don't have to serve anymore, and you can reduce that sentence. Right now, there's an extraordinary effort going on the federal level, where President Obama started out with very few commutations, and because of the urgings of reformers like Professor Mark Osler, who I write about in my book, who started the nation's first federal commutation clinic, the president is pardoning or commuting the sentences of more and more people to try to scale back this large over-incarceration of non-violent drug offenders in the federal system. And that's the power that I'm advocating that the governors do as well, that we try to identify people who are nonviolent offenders who are serving overly long sentences. And I've done a couple of these petitions, one of them for this man who got a life sentence for selling a small amount of drugs. So that is, that's another way that we can help kind of reduce this problem of incarceration. Why does this matter? It matters because I do believe that every human being is precious, every life is precious, and every person's capable of redemption. And we have a system that doesn't reflect that. When the young man who killed my sister and her husband, David Bureau, got that sentence of life without parole, this is before the change of heart that I write about in my book. And when he was taken from the lockup through the door, from the courtroom through the door into the lockup behind the courtroom, my mother was sitting next to me, and she said, "We'll never see him again." And I was glad of that. I wanted that. I'd forgiven him kind of in my own mind and heart, but the forgiveness was like this: I forgive you, and now I'm wiping you off my hands like dirt. I'm ready to throw you away into the maw of prison and never think of you again. And the change of heart was getting me to see that God loves him. God loves him every bit as much as God loves me. He's a child of God. And that he is on this flat plane of grace that we all receive. Everyone in this room knows that there is something of which we need to be forgiven. Some hurt that we've done, some way that we've failed. And we all have that sense that we know that we need to go to someone and say, I'm sorry, will you take me back? Can I come back in? And we all know what it's like to have been betrayed or wounded or hurt in some way. Somebody who let you down terribly or did something so unfair that you can't understand it. And so we understand that there's also this need to forgive. I'm so grateful to be in a room of people who care deeply about community and society and what kind of society we want to be. Whether it's one that does throw people away forever or does want to find a way, as the restorative justice person here does, of wanting to try to bring people back, to have that healing and that wholeness. I want to open this up to your questions and discussion and everything, but I'm going to end just by reading a small excerpt from my book. There was a moment that I write about when I had kind of gotten to that point of changing my mind about juvenile life sentences, about seeing that they were wrong. And it takes place at an outdoor church service in Chicago. We have this beautiful Lake Michigan and lakefront, and there's a church there that has services out on the beach. And the priest there was talking about messiness, human messiness, how we are all kind of a mess and we fail. And he said, and how did God respond to that messiness? Mercy, mercy, mercy. Then I reflected, as we were lining up to take the Eucharist, the bread and wine, we say, Lamb of God, have mercy on us. And I reflected on that and I said, I know that we can't say to any human being, we're freezing in time forever this crime you committed. No matter how much you do, how much you repent and show remorse, you're forever only one thing, killer. And we'll punish you endlessly for it. I knew this in my heart. I could no longer support this merciless sentence of life without parole. And then the very next moment, like daylight breaking into darkness, I knew something else. I'd always thought the only thing big enough to pay for the life of my sister was the life sentence for her killer. Now I understood. The only thing big enough to equal the loss of her life was for him to be found. My friend Sister Helen Prejean, the author of Dead Man Walking, who wrote this wonderful blurb for my book, says that the sentences that we give so often are the opposite of baptism. In my Presbyterian church in downtown Chicago, when we baptize a child, we hold it up in front of the whole congregation and we say, you are a beloved child of God, and you belong to God and to us forever. And that in these sentences, like juvenile life sentences, like life without parole, like these mandatory minimums, we're saying the opposite. We're saying you're human garbage, and we are putting you away from us. We're throwing you away. And so that's what I'm urging today, for mercy, for opportunities for mercy, and for restoration, a bringing back and a making whole. And now I would love to hear any questions or thoughts that you have.
Can you tell us a little bit, Jean, about what the current status is of the young man?
So the U.S. Supreme Court in 2012 issued a decision called Miller versus Alabama, and that decision said that the sentence, one of the sentences that the killer is serving, which is the mandatory sentence of life without parole, is unconstitutional, that it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And what Justice Kagan's decision said is that you can still give a life sentence for a juvenile, but you can't do it as a mandatory sentence. In other words, the young man who killed Nancy and Richard was convicted of a double homicide and he immediately got that sentence. There was no aggravation and mitigation proceedings where the judge would hear the good things about him and the bad things about him and then impose the sentence. What the judge had to do was do that life sentence. And what Miller says is you have to consider all sorts of factors. Where did this kid come from? What kind of a childhood did he have? Was he experiencing any trauma, any coercion, things like that? And then you've got to consider the age. So that's a good development in the law.
Tony Kemper, the DePaul School. When your heart was changed, was there anything that was released? And in your life, was there anything that was gained or learned?
That's such a beautiful question. What was released was this, I call it like a stone on my heart that got rolled away. This stone of, they say that hating another person is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. That you carry around, the anger you carry around is a burden on you. It doesn't affect the other person at all. And I think what was gained was a humility, a sense of, before I think I had built this wall, very convenient for me, where on one side is you, the evil murderer, and on the other side is me, the good innocent victim's family member. And I think that what I learned is that God breaks down that wall, and that we are brothers and sisters.
Renee Brown, I heard that you said that you changed from, I guess, what you were doing in corporate law to being a public defender. Are you now defending cases such as that happened to your sister?
Yes, I'm defending murder cases as a public defender, and it's been a really wonderful thing for me to bring the perspective of a murder victim's family member, because the standard I hold myself to is very high, and that is that I will never make an argument in court or to a judge or a jury that isn't something that I couldn't say right looking into the eyes of a murder victim's family member in that case. That I want to operate with such, integrity and compassion also for them. One of the things I write about in the book is the extraordinary compassion I was shown by the lawyer in my sister's murder case. His name was Bob Gevertz, and the first thing he did when he met me is to say, I want you to know that in defending this young man who killed your sister, that it takes nothing away from the fact that I feel so terrible about this tragedy in your family. It was so gracious. Yeah.
Hi, Sydney Gates. How do you think your path to forgiveness would have been changed if the killer was not incarcerated?
That's a wonderful question. I know how lucky my family is. I was shocked years ago when I read a Time magazine article that said that of people in our situation where the crime was solved, where there was actually an identification of who did it, and an arrest, and a trial, and a conviction, and a sentence, that's actually 16% of murder victims' family members. So I understand that, and I actually encountered that. A secretary in my office came to me one day and said, my sister died at the same age as yours. She was 25 years old. She had just started a job as a nurse. She was renting a room in this house, and she was found the next day, bound and stabbed to death, blood all over the room. And that was, 25 years ago, and no one knows who did it. And I wish I could forgive the killer like you, but I don't even know who to forgive because I don't even know who did it. And so, that's a struggle that's hard for me to imagine. I think the idea is, I found this wonderful thing that my father had written, years after he died, in an old filing cabinet that we were cleaning out. And he was teaching this confirmation class at his church for 7th and 8th graders. And his notes about this lecture on forgiveness that he gave them said that forgiveness has two parts. That the first part is the letting go. Just the letting go of your righteous, justifiable anger at this terrible thing that's happened to you. And he said the second part is equally important, and that's the letting in. The letting in back into a relationship of the person who's hurt you. I think that if he had not, been incarcerated, if we didn't know, what had happened or identified who he was, I could have done that letting go part. But the blessing for me is that because of this reconciliation I've done with him, I also get to do that letting in.
I'm Susan Smith, and thank you very much for opening our minds and our hearts. Two principles of restorative justice are the family impact, the family having the opportunity to share their story with the perpetrator, and also the perpetrator accepting responsibility for his or her actions. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether and if and how that happened, and what the current status of your involvement in any relationship with him is.
Yeah, so I write about this in the book. Mark Osler, the professor that I told you about, in the wake of Miller versus Alabama, when it was clear that this young man was going to be resentenced who killed Nancy, I said, you know, I don't support juvenile life without parole mandatory sentences anymore, but I don't know how I feel about this guy getting out someday, because, you know, he's still remorseless. And Mark said, you don't know that. How do you know that? You've never even spoken to him. That was true. I've spoken all over the world about justice, mercy, forgiveness, and everything, and I told the whole world except this young man. And so I wrote him a letter in prison. I reprinted it in its entirety in my book, and it just said, I forgave you a long time ago, and I never told you, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry. And I waited all these years for you to apologize to me. I'm going to go first. I am sorry, and if you want me to come see you, I will. And I write about that first visit. It was so amazing, so healing to hear about Nancy's last moments and have these answers to questions that I'd had for so long. And also for him to hear my one-on-one victim impact statement, because we didn't get to have that in a mandatory sentence. You don't get to give a victim impact statement. The sentence is the sentence. So the ongoing relationship has been so great, and I'll tell you why. Because I can't talk about, you know, to anyone without talking about Nancy and my family. And what he said to me the other day is, the more I get to know you and get to know Nancy through you, the worse I feel about what I did. Because now she's not this nameless, you know, stranger in the dark that he fired a gun at. She's this vibrant, beautiful person that he knows is no longer in the world because of him.
Hi, I'm John Clark, and I just was curious. I had a couple of questions, and I'm not sure if you really answered this, but did you really look into his eyes and ask him why he did this, and what his response might have been specifically about that? And secondly, your opinion on the gun laws today. You have a 15-year-old, I think you said, with a .357 Magnum. And that's a hell of a statement, frankly, for what's going on in this world today and how easy it is to get weapons. But there's more to it than just that, I think. And really, since you are in this arena and have dedicated yourself to this arena, what are you seeing and what do you feel?
Those are great questions. The why, you know, it's interesting. After a while, you know, of not knowing why, years of not knowing why, I kind of felt like, you know, I don't even care why. Like, what reason could you give me that would be good enough for taking the life of my sister and her husband and their baby? And so when I got there to the visit that first time, you know, I wrote about this in the book. What I really didn't want to know was why. I kind of wanted to know, how did you get from being a little boy in this town where my boys live now, Winnetka, Illinois, to being a 16-year-old who can put a .357 Magnum revolver to the back of a grown man's head and pull the trigger? And he really needed to tell me why. And it's a complicated story, but he did, and it's a why that made sense to me. In terms of the second part about the gun violence, part of what I knew I needed to do in Nancy's name and in her memory was to not have it be this vengeance and bitterness and directed towards locking him up and making him pay and hoping he rots in hell. It had to be something proactive, something that would prevent the kind of gun violence that took her life. He stole that gun from a law office. He'd been in trouble with little minor things, and so he, you know, went into the law office and broke in and got this gun out of a drawer, and 2 days later used it to kill Nancy and Richard. A trigger lock would have saved her. Fingerprint identification on that gun would have saved her. Safe storage laws that make you responsible for a crime that's done with a gun that you leave sitting around in an unlocked drawer would have saved her. And so these are things that I think of which reasonable people can and should agree. So that's been definitely a part of one of the ways I've tried to honor the life of Nancy and Richard, is to try to make sure that we make it harder for a 16-year-old boy to get a gun and use it.
Angela, last question to you.
Thank you. Angela Leet. So my question is a little bit twofold. I mean, your journey to forgive is compelling. We feel I don't know, my heart beats a little bit faster, and my brain is thinking in ways that I've not had to experience before, hearing your experience firsthand. But I also heard you mention restorative justice and not putting people away for so long for non-violent offenses. And I know that here locally, even within our Department of Corrections here, we have so many people who are actually addicts that need help, that we're not helping. So to me, forgiveness is very, that journey is very personal. But I would wonder, what is your real call to action? Is it describing to people who are victims how to forgive? Or is it to say, let's look at our correction system and say, let's separate out and redefine?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it's for all of us, right? You know, restorative justice is not just for the victims and the offenders, it's also for the community. And it's kind of a bringing together of everyone to say, we've all been hurt by this in different ways. I mean, David Bureau recognizes that not only did he hurt me and my family, he hurt every single person who ever knew and loved Nancy, their coworkers, their neighbors, their friends. He knows that he hurt himself, obviously. He's looking at dying in prison. He hurt his own family. His sister really struggled with, you know, at the time that this happened, she was just starting her kind of dating life. And then how do you explain to the guy that you like and you're going out with that you've got this brother who's doing life for triple homicide? It was very hard on his mom. She died shortly after he was sentenced. I think of it like a broken heart. And so all of these broken pieces need redemption and healing, and we want to bring everybody together, I think, of finding solutions. One of the great restorative justice programs is in New York, and they talk about the old way of doing this. These mandatory sentences are like going to a restaurant and opening up the menu and seeing that you can order a hamburger. That's it. That's the one and only thing on the menu. If you're hungry and you come in here, you get a hamburger. And instead, what you want to open up the menu and find a lot of different things that you can choose from. And the example that they gave is a guy who was a victim of an armed robbery. And what he didn't want was another 5 years for this juvenile who pointed a gun in his face. What he wanted was to take his own children to meet this juvenile in custody and say, you see these girls, these daughters of mine, they're what I thought of when you pointed that gun at me. That I would never see them again, that they grow up without a father, and I wouldn't get to go to their high school graduation or walk them down the aisle at their wedding. And that was so impactful on this young man, that it was absolutely harrowing. That's an example, one small example of the kind of restorative justice where we can change people's lives, and by doing so, change the world.
Thank you. My prayers to you.
Thank you, Jean, for sharing that. And Jean will be with us after the meeting at the table, so you can talk with her further, get her book, and have her sign it. We thank you for sharing your powerful story. So, just a few closing announcements. Next week is Thanksgiving week, and if you don't know, our tradition as a club is we don't meet Thanksgiving Day. We'll meet on Wednesday, and we'll be with our Kiwanis friends. Our guest speaker will be Bob Russell, the former pastor of Southeast Christian Church, speaker and author, and we'll be in the Grand Ballroom A. So we hope you'll come, and then put a little sticky note on Tuesday so that you remember on Wednesday to bring warm, teen-appropriate hats, gloves, scarves, sweatshirts, jackets. Our Western High School interactors will be with us, we hope, and we'll be collecting all of those as their service project for their fellow students in need at Western High School. So don't forget to bring those warm items, and with that, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you.